A wanted notice appeared in 3 Virginia counties during March 1857, offering an unprecedented reward of $800 for details leading to the apprehension of Dana Lewis, a 30-year-old woman. The amount was extraordinary. Typical rewards for escaped enslaved individuals rarely went beyond $100. Nevertheless, the language of the notice made clear why this particular woman was deemed so exceptionally valuable. Wanted for promoting insurrection through teaching, circulation of seditious content, and undermining plantation authority. Subject demonstrates superior intelligence, literacy, and persuasive oratory. Considered extremely threatening to the established hierarchy. Approach cautiously. Subject exhibits capacity for calculated reasoning and manipulation of vulnerable individuals. The notice contained no physical portrayal of Dana Lewis. No mention of her stature, no identifying marks, none of the practical information bounty hunters commonly depended on. Instead, it warned against her intellect, her astuteness, her ability to influence others. The notice was pursuing an idea embodied in a person, a woman who had transformed from property into something the Virginia planter class viewed as an existential danger. What occurred in Dana Lewis's life between 1843 and 1857? How does a 16-year-old girl auctioned off become a 30-year-old woman so formidable that prosperous plantation owners pooled resources to finance her capture? The explanation requires no supernatural abilities, no physical violence, no dramatic uprising. Just intellect, persistence, and the awareness that the most effective resistance takes hold in people's minds long before it manifests in the fields. Before we examine how Dana Lewis became the woman Virginia so desperately sought, if you're fascinated by hidden narratives of defiance that confronted authority through intellect rather than force, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These accounts of calculated resistance don't get shared without support. Understanding where our audience connects from helps us continue our research. Dana entered the world in 1827 on a modest tobacco plantation in Louisiana County, Virginia. Her mother, whose name appears only as Ruth in scarce documentation, worked in the plantation household as a cook and laundress. Her father was unknown to her. The property, managed by a widow named Catherine Mercer, sustained just 23 enslaved individuals and produced modest tobacco harvests that barely kept the enterprise operational. Dana's early years were unremarkable by the grim standards of the era. She worked indoors beside her mother from age 6, mastering cooking, cleaning, and the invisible labor plantation mistresses demanded. Yet something set Dana apart from the other children, something that would ultimately redirect her entire path. She exhibited a curiosity that made adults uneasy. Catherine Mercer's grandson, writing in his journal decades later in an entry discovered by historians in 1923, recalled Dana from his childhood visits to his grandmother's farm. There was a Negro girl around my age who worked in the house. I must have been 7 or 8, making her the same age. What I remember most vividly was how she observed everything. Not in a submissive or attentive manner, but with a scrutinizing quality that seemed inappropriate for her station. When my grandmother issued orders, the other servants simply obeyed. But this girl, Dana, would watch the instruction being delivered, then observe the task being executed, as though she was examining the relationship between command and compliance, rather than merely carrying out directives. It unsettled me even as a child, though I couldn't have articulated why at the time. What Catherine Mercer's grandson had noticed was Dana's natural inclination toward systems-oriented thinking. She didn't merely perceive individual chores or commands. She recognized patterns, connections, the mechanics of how authority operated. This ability, unnoticed and underdeveloped, remained dormant through Dana's youth, like seeds awaiting the right conditions to sprout. Those conditions arrived in 1842 when Denina was 15. Catherine Mercer passed away suddenly, and the plantation passed to her son Thomas, who resided in Richmond and had no interest in managing a failing tobacco operation. Thomas Mercer made the economically rational choice to liquidate the estate. The land would be sold. The enslaved people would be auctioned. Everything would be converted to capital that could be invested in more lucrative ventures. The sale was set for April 1843, would be auctioned alongside her mother and the 21 other individuals who had lived and worked on the Mercer property their entire lives. The evening before the auction, Ruth pulled Denina aside in their cabin and confided something that Denina would carry with her forever. "Tomorrow they're going to separate us." Ruth said quietly, "I know it. You're young, strong, smart. You're going to bring good money. Me, I'm 38 and my hand's starting to ache. Different buyers are going to want us for different work. So, I need to tell you something now while I still can." She gripped Denina's hands. "You have a mind that works differently than most people. I've seen it since you were small. The way you notice things, understand things, figure out how things work. That's a gift, baby. But it's a dangerous gift for someone in our situation. Smart slaves make white folks nervous. They see intelligence in us as a threat, because it is a threat. It threatens every lie they tell themselves about why this system is natural and right." Ruth paused, choosing her next words carefully. "So, here's what I need you to understand. You're going to have to hide that mind of yours. Bury it deep. Act simple when you need to. Don't let them see you thinking. Don't let them know you understand more than you're supposed to. Because if they see what you really are, they'll either try to beat it out of you, or they'll sell you somewhere so harsh and isolated that your mind won't matter anymore. You survive by making them think you're less than you are. You hear me?" Denina heard her, and she remembered the April 1843 auction occurred at the Louisiana County Courthouse, a typical venue for such proceedings. 23 people were sold that day, their existences reconfigured according to market reasoning that regarded human beings as agricultural equipment. Ruth was bought by a farmer from neighboring Hanover County for $450, a modest amount reflecting her age and the toll of years of labor on her body. Denina never saw her mother again. Denina herself stood on the auction block at roughly 2 p.m. According to the auctioneer's records, preserved in county archives, the auctioneer's description read aloud to prospective buyers survives in his ledger. Female, age 16 years, healthy constitution. Experience in house service including cooking, cleaning, laundry, and personal attendance. No history of resistance or difficulty. Literate to basic degree. Can read simple texts and write basic words. Well, mannered and obedient. That mention of literacy was unusual. Most auctioneers wouldn't advertise enslaved people's ability to read, as literacy was illegal for slaves in Virginia and many other states. But the auctioneer noted it because some buyers valued literate slaves for specific purposes, record-keeping or message-carrying, despite the legal risks. And Denina's literacy, acquired through covered observation of Catherine Mercer's grandchildren being tutored, would prove to be the foundation of everything she became. The bidding was competitive. Denina was young, healthy, trained in house service, and modestly educated. The final bid came from a man named Edward Whitmore, a plantation owner from Albemarle County, who paid $920 for Denina, an exceptional sum for a 16-year-old female slave. Whitmore wasn't buying labor capacity alone. He was buying potential. He had specific plans for Denina that would inadvertently give her exactly what she needed to become dangerous. Whitmore's plantation sprawled across 800 acres of Virginia Piedmont, 40 miles southwest of the Mercer farm, where Denina had spent her entire life. The estate sustained 187 enslaved people, produced wheat and corn, and operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that larger plantations required. Edward Whitmore, 52 years old in 1843, ran his plantation with meticulous attention to record-keeping, inventory management, and documentation. He needed someone literate to help manage the plantation's extensive paperwork. Someone smart enough to learn complex organizational systems, but controllable enough to be trusted with access to sensitive information. He believed he'd found that person in Denina Lewis. Denina arrived at Whitmore Plantation in late April 1843 and was immediately assigned to work in the plantation office, a small building adjacent to the main house where Edward Whitmore managed his business operations. Her duties involved copying records, organizing documents, maintaining inventory lists, and assisting with correspondence. The work required literacy, numeracy, and organizational thinking, skills that most enslaved people weren't permitted to develop, skills that Denina absorbed like dry earth absorbing rain. For the first year, Denina performed her duties exactly as expected. She was quiet, deferential, efficient. She followed instructions precisely. She caused no problems. She appeared to be exactly what Edward Whitmore had paid $920 to acquire, a useful tool for managing information. But Denina was doing something else, something that Whitmore didn't recognize because he'd never imagined an enslaved person capable of it. She was studying the plantation's entire operational structure through its documentation. Every supply order revealed which crops were being planted and in what quantities. Every inventory list showed what resources the plantation possessed. Every piece of correspondence disclosed relationships with other plantations, banks, merchants, and political figures. The plantation journals documented every punishment, every escape attempt, every conflict between overseers and enslaved workers. Denina spent 10 to 12 hours a day surrounded by information that revealed exactly how the plantation functioned, how profit was generated, how control was maintained, how the system's various components interconnected, and she was memorizing all of it. Not the specific details, which would have been impossible, but the patterns, the logic, the mechanics of how power organized itself on paper before manifesting as violence in the fields. She was learning to read the system the way some people learn to read weather patterns or animal behavior, developing an intuitive understanding of how plantation economics and plantation discipline reinforced each other, how debt structures constrained even wealthy planters' decisions, how the constant threat of sale or separation was used to enforce compliance, how information control kept enslaved people isolated and ignorant of opportunities beyond their immediate circumstances. And she was doing all of this while appearing to be nothing more than a capable copyist who happened to read well. Sarah Whitmore, Edward's wife, wrote in her diary in November 1844, an entry preserved in the Whitmore family papers at the University of Virginia. The girl Denina, who works in Edward's office, is remarkably efficient. Edward speaks highly of her ability to organize his paperwork and maintain his records. I confess I find her somewhat unsettling, though I cannot articulate precisely why. She is always respectful, always appropriate in her behavior. Yet, there is something in her eyes when she thinks no one is watching, an alertness, an attention, as if she is not merely performing tasks, but studying the entire household. I mentioned this observation to Edward, but he dismissed it as feminine fancy. Sarah Whitmore's instinct was correct, but by the time anyone else recognized it, Denina would be 4 years into her transformation from property into something much more dangerous. The turning point came in 1845 when Denina was 18. A letter arrived at Whitmore Plantation from a Richmond merchant requesting payment for agricultural supplies delivered 3 months earlier. Edward Whitmore was traveling on business, so the letter sat on his desk awaiting his return. Danina, organizing correspondence during Whitmore's absence, read the letter. Then she did something extraordinary. She reviewed the plantation's financial records, which she maintained access to through her office work, and discovered that the supplies in question had already been paid for in cash. The Richmond merchant was attempting to collect twice for the same delivery. When Whitmore returned, Danina mentioned the discrepancy, not directly or assertively, but in the deferential tone expected of her. "Master Whitmore, sir, I noticed this letter from the Richmond merchant. I believe you might want to check the August payment records before responding." Whitmore reviewed the records, discovered the double billing attempt, and wrote an angry letter to the merchant, threatening legal action. The merchant withdrew his claim immediately, caught in outright fraud. Whitmore had saved $300 to $400, a significant sum, because Danina had noticed something. This incident changed Whitmore's perception of Danina. She wasn't just a competent copyist. She understood the records well enough to spot financial irregularities. She could be trusted with more complex tasks, more responsibility, more access to information. Over the next 2 years, Danina's duties expanded. She began preparing draft correspondence for Whitmore's review. She started tracking complex financial obligations across multiple creditors. She helped organize the plantation's legal documents relating to property deeds, insurance policies, and commercial contracts. She became, in effect, Whitmore's personal secretary, an enslaved woman managing sensitive information that most plantation owners wouldn't trust to their own white clerks. And through this access, Danina was building something invisible but powerful, a comprehensive understanding of how Virginia's plantation economy actually functioned. Not the mythology taught in parlors and churches about natural hierarchies and benevolent paternalism. The reality documented in ledgers and contracts, how planters juggled crushing debts to banks and factors, how they squeezed enslaved people to generate cash flow to service those debts, how the entire system was far more fragile economically than anyone publicly admitted. Danina was also learning something else. She was discovering through the correspondence she read and copied that the enslaved people on Whitmore's plantation weren't isolated. Other plantations existed within traveling distance. Networks of communication existed between plantations through various legitimate channels like supplied deliveries, equipment repairs, and seasonal labor exchanges. Information could travel through these networks if someone understood how to access them. By 1847, when Danina was 20, she had accumulated 4 years of intensive education in plantation operations, economic systems, and information networks. She'd done this while appearing to be nothing more than a reliable office worker. She'd hidden her growing understanding behind a mask of compliance, so perfect that Edward Whitmore considered her his most valuable asset. But something was changing in Danina. The knowledge she'd accumulated was reaching a critical mass. She understood how the system worked in granular detail. She could see its vulnerabilities, its contradictions, its reliance on information control to maintain itself, and she was beginning to ask herself a question that would transform her from an exceptionally well-informed enslaved woman into something that Virginia planters would eventually consider worth $800 to capture. If she understood the system this clearly, what could she do with that understanding? The answer would reveal itself over the next 10 years. As Danina Lewis discovered that the most powerful resistance doesn't happen in dramatic confrontations. It happens in quiet conversations, in information shared across networks, in people learning to understand their own circumstances clearly enough to make strategic choices about resistance. rather than just reacting to immediate oppression. She was about to become an educator, and education in the context of slavery was the most dangerous weapon imaginable. The transformation of Denina Lewis from informed observer to active resistance operator began not with a dramatic decision, but with a simple conversation in the summer of 1847. A young woman named Clara, recently purchased by Edward Whitmore from a failing plantation in Orange County, was struggling to adapt to Whitmore's demanding work expectations. Clara had been assigned to the weaving house, but was falling behind on production quotas, which would inevitably result in punishment. Denina encountered Clara one evening near the quarters. The young woman sitting alone with her hands covering her face, clearly terrified of the consequences she was facing. What Denina did next was unremarkable on the surface, but radical in its implications. She sat down beside Clara and asked a question. "Do you know why Master Whitmore sets the quotas he does for the weaving house?" Clara looked up, confused by the question. "Because he wants the work done." "That's what he wants," Denina said quietly. "But do you know why he wants exactly 18 yards per day from each weaver? Why not 15 or 20? Do you know how he calculated that number?" Clara had never considered the question. Most enslaved people didn't question the logic behind their master's demands. They simply tried to meet them or suffered when they couldn't. Denina continued, keeping her voice low and calm. "I've seen the records. Master Whitmore calculated that quota based on how much cloth he needs to produce to meet his contracts with Richmond merchants. Those contracts are based on prices that barely cover his costs after he pays his debts to the bank. He's operating on thin margins, which means those quotas aren't arbitrary. They're the minimum he needs to avoid financial trouble. But here's what matters to you. The quota assumes you're working at full speed, all day with no mistakes and no material waste. It doesn't account for learning time if you're new. It doesn't account for variations in material quality that slow you down. It's designed around ideal conditions that rarely exist." Clara was listening now, her fear temporarily replaced by curiosity. "So when you fall short," Denina said, "it's not because you're lazy or incompetent. It's because the quota itself is unrealistic for someone still learning. Master Whitmore knows this, but he maintains the quota anyway, because showing any flexibility would set a precedent. The overseers know it too, which is why they're so quick to punish. They're enforcing the illusion that the quota is reasonable and achievable when the records show that new workers almost never meet it in their first months." "What am I supposed to do with that information?" Clara asked. "Knowing why I can't meet the quota doesn't help me avoid punishment." "No," Denina agreed. "But knowing why the quota exists helps you understand what you're actually dealing with. You're not fighting your own inadequacy. You're caught in a system where the demands are calculated to extract maximum value regardless of human cost. Understanding that doesn't solve your immediate problem, but it changes how you think about your situation. It replaces self-blame with clarity." It was a small conversation, 5 minutes beside the quarters on a summer evening, but it represented something new. Denina was sharing her understanding of the system's mechanics with someone who lacked that understanding. She was teaching. And Clara, despite still facing punishment for her production shortfall, left that conversation with something she hadn't possessed before. A framework for understanding her circumstances that replaced internalized failure with systemic analysis. She couldn't change her situation immediately, but she understood it differently, and understanding Denina was beginning to realize was the first step toward anything else. Over the following months, Denina engaged in similar conversations with other enslaved people on Whitmore's plantation. Not frequently enough to draw attention, not obviously enough to be recognized as teaching, just occasional quiet discussions where she shared insights drawn from her access to plantation records and correspondence. She explained to field workers why harvest quotas increase during certain months based on market prices and debt payment schedules. She clarified to house servants why certain rules that seemed arbitrary were actually connected to the Whitmores' social positioning among other planter families. She helped people understand that punishments, while brutal and personal in their application, were often responses to economic pressures that had nothing to do with the individuals being punished. She was doing something that slaveholders feared more than physical rebellion. She was teaching enslaved people to think analytically about their circumstances, to see patterns, to understand cause and effect, to recognize that the system wasn't natural or inevitable, but constructed, maintained, and vulnerable to being understood. By 1848, something subtle but noticeable was happening at Whitmore Plantation. The enslaved community was developing what Edward Whitmore and his overseers couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt: a quality of awareness. People continued doing their assigned work, but the psychological texture of their compliance had changed. They understood why they were being asked to do things, which created a small but significant psychological distance between being ordered and obeying. Thomas Reeves, Whitmore's head overseer, mentioned this to Edward in a conversation recorded in Whitmore's Plantation Journal in August 1848. "Something's changed with the people this year. Can't put my finger on it exactly. They're not openly resistant. They're not refusing work or talking back. But they're different somehow. It's like they're watching us watch them. Like they're thinking about what we're doing instead of just responding to it. Makes me nervous in a way I can't properly explain." Edward dismissed Reeves's concerns as overseer paranoia, a common affliction among men whose authority depended on maintaining psychological dominance. But Reeves was right. Something had changed, and Denina Lewis was the reason. In 1849, Denina took her teaching to the next level. She began deliberately seeking opportunities to interact with enslaved people from other plantations. Whitmore Plantation, like most large operations, regularly borrowed labor from neighbors for harvest seasons and lent out workers for specialized tasks like equipment repair or construction. These exchanges created brief windows where Denina could share information beyond Whitmore's property. She would engage workers visiting from other plantations in casual conversation, then casually mention something useful. "At Whitmore, we figured out that if you stagger your work pace during the day based on when the overseers make their rounds, you can actually work less overall while appearing to work consistently. The overseers only check production at specific times. Outside those windows, you can slow down without consequence. Or I've seen Master Whitmore's ledgers. He's over $400 in debt to Richmond banks. That debt affects every decision he makes about pushing production. He's not driving you hard because he's naturally cruel. He's desperate. Understanding his desperation helps you predict when he's likely to increase demands versus when he might be flexible." These small pieces of information shared in conversations that looked like idle talk traveled back to other plantations. And they carried something more valuable than the specific content. They carried a method, a way of thinking about plantations as systems that could be analyzed, understood, and potentially manipulated. By 1850, Denina's reputation had spread through the invisible networks that connected Virginia's enslaved communities. She wasn't famous, wasn't known by name to most people, but words circulated about a woman at Whitmore Plantation who understood how things really worked and would share that understanding if you could get access to her. People began requesting to be assigned to projects at Whitmore, specifically so they could talk to Denina. Overseers on other plantations noticed that workers who'd spent time at Whitmore came back changed. More thoughtful, more analytical, less responsive to traditional control methods. A plantation owner in Fauquier County named Harrison Dobbs wrote to Edward Whitmore in March 1851. A letter preserved in the Whitmore papers, complaining about this phenomenon. 3 of my people worked at your plantation during your barn construction last autumn. Since their return, I've noticed a marked change in their behavior. Not open insolence which I could punish directly, something subtler. They've developed a habit of asking why when given orders. Not refusing the orders, just asking about the reasoning behind them. This questioning has spread to others who weren't at your property. I'm writing to ask if you've noticed similar patterns and whether you've identified any source of this attitude. It concerns me that extended exposure to your plantation operations may be introducing ideas that undermine proper discipline. Edward Whitmore read the letter with growing alarm. He hadn't noticed any problems with his own enslaved population, but Dobbs's description was troubling. The idea that something at Whitmore Plantation was teaching people to think critically about orders, rather than simply obeying them, was deeply concerning. But what could be causing it? Whitmore's operations weren't unusual. His discipline wasn't notably lenient. His overseers were experienced and competent. The possibility that the problem was Denina didn't occur to him. She was a valued office worker, trustworthy with sensitive information essential to his record-keeping. The notion that she might be using her access to information as a foundation for teaching systematic resistance was beyond his conceptual framework. How could an enslaved woman working quietly at a desk copying documents possibly be the source of ideological contamination spreading across multiple plantations? But she was, and by 1852, when Denina was 25, she had expanded her activities beyond informal conversations into something more structured. She was running what amounted to secret classes. The classes weren't held in any formal location and didn't follow any regular schedule. They occurred opportunistically whenever circumstances allowed. A few enslaved people gathering during a Sunday rest period, a group taking a meal break away from overseer observation. Workers meeting in the woods during the brief windows between assigned tasks. These gatherings looked innocent, just people resting together. But Denina was using them to transmit information with increasing sophistication. She taught basic literacy to those who wanted to learn using charcoal on bark or scratched letters in dirt that could be quickly erased. She explained how to read simple documents like travel passes or property deeds so people could understand the legal structures constraining them. She shared information about geography, helping people understand the relationships between Virginia counties, nearby free states, and potential escape routes. But more importantly, she taught analytical thinking. She helped people understand plantation economics, the relationship between cotton prices and treatment, the impact of abolitionist pressure on Southern planters' behavior, the legal frameworks surrounding slavery, and how they were enforced. She was creating what modern educators would call critical consciousness, the ability to analyze systems of power rather than just experience them. A man named Isaac, who attended several of Denina's informal teaching sessions in 1852, later testified about them in a deposition given to Union authorities during the Civil War. His account, preserved in National Archives records, provides rare direct evidence of Denina's methods. Miss Denina, we called her, though not to white folks' hearing. She had a way of explaining things that made you feel like scales falling from your eyes. She'd tell us about how Master needed cotton prices to stay high to pay his debts. How if prices dropped? He'd push us harder or sell some of us to raise cash. How his treatment of us wasn't about moral judgments of our work, but about economic pressures he was under. Understanding that changed something in how we thought about everything. We stopped seeing punishment as personal and started seeing it as systematic. That knowledge didn't free us, but it freed our minds to understand what we were actually dealing with. Isaac's testimony also revealed something else about Danina's teaching. She never advocated direct rebellion, never encouraged violence, never suggested dramatic escape attempts that would likely fail. Instead, she taught patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of understanding before acting. Miss Danina always said that most resistance fails because people act from anger or desperation, without understanding what they're really up against. She taught us to study the system first, learn its patterns, identify its vulnerabilities, only then consider what action might actually succeed. She was teaching us to be strategic rather than reactive. This approach made Danina's influence both more powerful and harder to detect than traditional forms of resistance. People who'd learned from her didn't immediately attempt escape or openly defy authority. They simply became harder to control through traditional methods. They understood the motivations behind orders, which made them less psychologically dominated by those orders. They recognized economic pressures driving plantation decisions, which helped them predict and prepare for changes in treatment. They developed networks of information sharing that allowed coordinated subtle resistance without central organization. By 1853, multiple plantations across 5 Virginia counties were experiencing what their owners described as disciplinary deterioration, not dramatic rebellions or mass escapes. Something more insidious, a gradual erosion of the psychological control that slavery depended on. Enslaved people asking questions, demanding explanations, sharing information, understanding the economic and social systems, constraining them clearly enough to identify opportunities for subtle resistance. And a disturbing number of these cases could be traced back through chains of information and interaction to people who'd spent time at Whitmore Plantation, who'd talked to a woman named Danina, who'd learned from her that understanding systems was the first step toward challenging them. In January 1854, a group of Virginia plantation owners met in Richmond to discuss what they termed the discipline problem. The meeting minutes discovered in Virginia Historical Society archives in 1889 revealed growing panic about changing dynamics on plantations across the region. One attendee, a planter named Richard Saunders, described the situation with unusual clarity. "We are facing a threat more dangerous than any abolition society or underground railroad. Someone somewhere is teaching our slaves to think analytically about their circumstances, to understand plantation economics, to recognize that our authority is based on systems rather than natural order. This education is spreading through networks we can't see or control, and it's producing a generation of slaves who comply with orders while no longer psychologically accepting the legitimacy of those orders. They're performing a kind of internal emancipation while remaining physically enslaved. And I don't know how we combat that." The plantation owners at that meeting discussed various responses: stricter communication controls between plantations, prohibition on interplantation labor exchanges, increased surveillance and punishment for gatherings. But they recognized that these measures addressed symptoms rather than source. Someone was teaching systematic resistance, and until they identified and stopped that person, the problem would continue spreading. In March 1854, Edward Whitmore received a visit from 2 plantation owners, Harrison Dobbs from Fauquier County and Marcus Talmadge from Louisa County. They requested a private meeting where they shared a disturbing theory. Multiple slaves, who demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking and systematic understanding that was causing discipline problems, had spent time at Whitmore Plantation. The common factor was exposure to Whitmore's operations. Could something about Whitmore's management be inadvertently teaching resistance? Edward insisted his plantation ran normally. Standard discipline, experienced overseers. Nothing unusual in his approach. But Dobbs pressed him. Edward, think carefully. Is there anyone on your property who has unusual access to information about how plantations operate? Anyone who interacts regularly with visiting workers? Anyone intelligent enough to understand complex systems and articulate enough to teach others? Edward's face went pale as the realization struck. Denina, his office worker, his trusted record keeper, the enslaved woman he'd given extensive access to sensitive information because she was so capable and reliable. Could she possibly be using that access to educate others? The possibility seemed absurd. Denina was quiet, deferential, completely compliant. She'd never caused any trouble. She'd worked in his office for nearly 11 years without incident. But the more Edward thought about it, the more certain details became unsettling: her unusual literacy, her obvious intelligence, her regular interactions with workers from other plantations who came through Whitmore's operations, the way she always seemed to be listening carefully to conversations. Even when she appeared focused on her work, Edward made a decision that would prove to be his greatest mistake. Instead of confronting Denina directly or restricting her activities, gradually, he decided to test her to see if she really was the source of the problem. He began deliberately leaving documents around the office that contained false information, fake correspondence about plantation economics, incorrect data about crop prices and debt obligations, information designed to be useful to someone trying to teach others about how plantations operated, but wrong enough that anyone repeating it would reveal themselves as the source. It was a trap, and Denina walked straight into it. Within 3 weeks, Edward heard from a neighboring plantation owner that one of his slaves had been caught sharing information about regional crop prices. The information was specific, detailed, and completely wrong. It matched exactly the false data Edward had left in his office. The slave, when questioned about where he'd learned this information, eventually admitted he'd heard it from a woman at Whitmore Plantation who understood how things really work. Edward had his answer. Denina Lewis, his trusted office worker, was using her access to information to educate enslaved people across multiple counties. She was the source of the analytical resistance, spreading through Virginia's plantation system. She was teaching systematic understanding of how slavery functioned, and that understanding was undermining the psychological control that slavery depended on. On April 12, 1854, Edward Whitmore confronted Denina in his office. What he didn't realize was that Denina had noticed his trap weeks earlier, had recognized the false information for what it was, and had deliberately shared it to confirm her suspicions that she was being tested. She'd known this confrontation was coming, and she'd been preparing for it. The conversation between Edward Whitmore and Denina Lewis that April morning was recorded in remarkable detail in Whitmore's private journal, written the same evening. His account reveals both his shock at discovering what Denina had been doing and his struggle to understand how someone he'd considered property could have operated with such strategic sophistication, right under his observation for years. I asked her directly if she'd been teaching others about plantation operations. Whitmore wrote, she didn't deny it, didn't show fear or remorse, just looked at me with calm eyes and said, "Yes, Master Whitmore. I've been helping people understand how the system works because understanding is the only defense enslaved people have against being completely consumed by it. I demanded to know how long this had been happening, she said. Since about 1847, 8 years, long enough to reach hundreds of people across multiple counties, long enough that stopping me now won't undo what I've already accomplished. I was furious. I told her she'd betrayed my trust, that I'd given her opportunities no slave should have, that she'd used those opportunities to undermine the entire social order. Her response still haunts me, she said. You gave me access to information so I could serve you better. I used that information to serve my people better. You wanted me intelligent enough to manage your records, but not intelligent enough to understand what those records revealed about how slavery actually works. That was your mistake. Intelligence doesn't come with selective blindness. Once you teach someone to think analytically, you can't control what they analyze. Edward's journal entry reveals that he was genuinely shaken by this exchange, not just by Danina's actions, but by the implication of those actions. That the very qualities that made her valuable to him, her intelligence and analytical capacity, were the same qualities that made her dangerous to the entire system. That by giving an enslaved woman the education and access she needed to serve his interests, he'd inadvertently created exactly the kind of resistance that slavery couldn't defend against. Intellectual resistance, systematic education, the spread of understanding that undermined compliance. Edward Whitmore faced a decision. He could punish Danina severely and keep her on his plantation under strict control. He could sell her, transferring the problem to someone else. Or he could do something that would ultimately prove catastrophic. He could try to contain the damage by restricting Danina's activities while maintaining her usefulness in the office. He chose the third option. Danina was forbidden from any contact with enslaved people outside Whitmore Plantation. Her work duties were restricted to the office with no outside interactions. An overseer would monitor her movements at all times outside working hours. She would continue her record-keeping work, because Edward still needed her capabilities. But her access to people would be eliminated. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing, because by 1854, Danina Lewis had already created something that didn't require her continued direct involvement. She'd established networks of people, teaching what she'd taught them. She'd spread a methodology of analytical thinking that was reproducing itself across plantations. She'd planted seeds that were growing in soil she could no longer tend, but no longer needed to. And more importantly, word of why Danina had been restricted spread through the enslaved community with remarkable speed. People learned that the woman who taught them to understand the system had been caught and confined, and that knowledge itself became a form of education. If the plantation owners were this frightened of someone teaching analytical thinking, then analytical thinking must be genuinely powerful. If they were willing to restrict a valuable office worker to prevent her from sharing information, then information must be genuinely dangerous to them. Danina's restriction didn't contain the problem. It advertised the power of what she'd been doing. For the next 2 years, from 1854 to 1856, Danina worked in Edward Whitmore's office under constant surveillance. She continued managing records, copying documents, maintaining the plantation's complex paperwork, but she had no access to other enslaved people beyond brief monitored interactions. She couldn't teach, couldn't share information, couldn't continue the work she'd been doing. But the work continued without her. The people she'd taught were teaching others. The analytical methods she'd spread were spreading further. The understanding of plantation systems she'd shared was being refined, and expanded by others who'd learned to think as she taught them to think. By late 1856, Edward Whitmore was receiving letters from plantation owners as far away as North Carolina describing the same discipline problems. Enslaved people demonstrating systematic understanding of plantation economics. Workers sharing information about legal structures and escape routes. Groups coordinating subtle resistance based on analysis of overseer patrol patterns and production quota calculations. And when these slaves were questioned about where they'd learned to think this way, the trail often led back through multiple degrees of separation to someone who'd talked to someone who'd met a woman at Whitmore Plantation years earlier. Denina Lewis, confined to an office and monitored constantly, had become more dangerous in restriction than she'd ever been in freedom of movement, because her restriction had transformed her from teacher into symbol. Proof that the plantation owners feared education more than rebellion. Evidence that systematic understanding was powerful enough to threaten the entire structure of slavery. In January 1857, Edward Whitmore made his final fatal mistake. He decided to sell Denina, not to punish her, but to protect himself. Her continued presence on his plantation was drawing unwanted attention. Other planters blamed him for creating the problem by giving an enslaved woman too much access to information. His reputation was suffering, and he believed that selling Denina to a plantation far from Virginia would end his association with the problem. He sold her to a cotton plantation in Georgia for $600, a loss of $320 from what he'd paid 14 years earlier. The loss reflected Denina's reputation. Any buyer knew they were purchasing someone dangerous, someone who'd spent years teaching systematic resistance, someone who understood plantation operations well enough to explain their vulnerabilities to others. The plantation that bought Denina was owned by a man named Samuel Grantham, who believed he could control someone who'd outmaneuvered Virginia planters for years. He had strict protocols, isolated location, and absolute confidence in his ability to break resistant slaves into compliance. He was wrong, and what happened in the 6 weeks between Denina's arrival in Georgia and her escape would lead to the 800 reward notice that appeared across Virginia in March 1857. Hunting a 30-year-old woman who'd become something the South had never seen before and couldn't allow to exist. A teacher of systematic resistance who understood power clearly enough to show others how to challenge it. Denina Lewis arrived at Grantham Plantation in southern Georgia on February 3, 1857. The journey from Virginia had taken 8 days, transported in a slave coffle with 14 other people being relocated south. The experience was deliberately brutal, designed to break any sense of identity or resistance before arrival at their new locations. Denina endured it with the same patient calculation she'd applied to everything else. She observed the route, memorized landmarks, noted the spacing between towns, and the locations of rivers that might serve as navigation markers, if needed later. Grantham Plantation was everything Whitmore Plantation wasn't. Where Whitmore had been relatively organized and systematic, Grantham was chaotic and violent. Samuel Grantham was a self-made man who'd built his wealth through aggressive expansion, ruthless cost-cutting, and brutal labor extraction. His plantation sustained 340 enslaved people across 400 or 500 acres of cotton fields, but the operation ran on terror rather than efficiency. Grantham had purchased Denina, specifically because of her reputation. Edward Whitmore had been honest about why he was selling her, explaining that she'd been teaching systematic resistance to enslaved people and had become a discipline problem. Most buyers would have avoided someone with that history, but Grantham saw opportunity. If he could break someone as sophisticated as Denina Lewis, if he could reduce a woman known for teaching resistance into visible submission, It would send a powerful message to everyone on his plantation, that no amount of intelligence or education could protect you from the system's power to destroy you. He intended to make Denina Lewis an object lesson in the futility of intellectual resistance. Denina was assigned to field work immediately upon arrival. No office duties, no house service, just cotton picking under the direct supervision of Grantham's most brutal overseer, a man named Clayton Marsh, who built his reputation on breaking resistant slaves. The message was clear. Your intelligence means nothing here. Your education is worthless. You're just labor now, and labor is controlled through pain and exhaustion. For the first week, Denina worked the cotton fields like everyone else. She picked her assigned rows, met her quotas through sheer determination, despite having no previous field experience, endured the overseer's verbal abuse and casual cruelty without response. She appeared to be exactly what Grantham wanted her to be, broken and compliant. But Denina was doing what she'd always done, observing, analyzing, understanding. Within 7 days, she'd mapped out Grantham Plantation's entire social structure. She'd identified which overseers were cruel by nature versus cruel by necessity. She'd noticed the patterns in how punishments were administered and which infractions drew attention versus which were overlooked. She'd recognized that Grantham's plantation operated on chaos and fear rather than systematic control, which meant it had different vulnerabilities than Whitmore's more organized operation. And she'd begun talking to the other enslaved people in her work crew. Not obviously teaching, not drawing attention. Just quiet conversations during the brief moments when Clayton Marsh's attention was elsewhere. Asking questions about how things worked on this plantation, how long people had been here, what they knew about the surrounding area, who had attempted escape, and how those attempts had failed. She was gathering information, building understanding, preparing for whatever opportunity might present itself. On February 12th, 9 days after Denina's arrival, something happened that changed everything. A young man named Benjamin, who worked in the same cotton field as Denina, collapsed from heat exhaustion. It was unseasonably warm for February, and Benjamin had been sick with fever for days, but forced to work anyway. His collapse wasn't unusual. People regularly worked until their bodies gave out. What was unusual was Clayton Marsh's response. Marsh interpreted Benjamin's collapse as malingering, an attempt to avoid work. He ordered Benjamin to stand up and continue working. When Benjamin couldn't, Marsh began beating him with a leather strap while he lay on the ground. The beating was severe enough that other workers stopped picking cotton to watch, their faces showing horror and helplessness. Denina walked over to where Marsh was beating Benjamin. Several workers later testified to what happened next, their accounts remarkably consistent despite being recorded at different times. Denina placed herself between Marsh and Benjamin's body. She didn't touch Marsh, didn't threaten him, just stood there creating a physical barrier. "Move," Marsh said, his whip still raised. "He's unconscious," Denina said calmly. "Beating him won't make him work. It'll just kill him. And Master Grantham doesn't profit from dead workers." It was the first time Denina had spoken directly to an overseer since arriving at Grantham Plantation. Her voice was level, reasonable, completely devoid of challenge or submission. She was stating facts, and the facts were undeniable. Benjamin was unconscious. Further beating served no purpose. Grantham had paid money for Benjamin and would lose that investment if he died. Marsh stared at Denina, recognizing something in her demeanor that unsettled him. This wasn't normal resistance. Normal resistance was emotional, reactive, powered by fear or anger. This was analytical, strategic. The response of someone who'd calculated exactly how far She could push without crossing into punishable defiance. "Get back to your row," Marsh finally said. Now, Danina returned to her work. Benjamin was carried to the sick house, where he eventually recovered. And the 40 people who'd witnessed the exchange understood something they hadn't fully grasped before. That even in a system as brutal as Grantham's, there were small spaces where intelligent resistance could function. Moments where stating uncomfortable facts calmly could stop violence without triggering punishment. Ways to protect others without openly challenging authority. It was a lesson and people were learning. Over the next 2 weeks, Danina found increasing opportunities to teach despite the restrictions on her movement and the surveillance she was under. Cotton field work ironically provided more teaching opportunities than office work had. She worked alongside dozens of people daily. Conversations could happen during work, disguised as the idle talk that overseers expected. Information could be shared through work songs, whose meanings the overseers couldn't decode. Teaching could occur in plain sight if it was subtle enough. Danina taught people about the geography beyond the plantation, how to identify the North Star and use it for navigation, how many miles to Florida where seafaring communities offered refuge, what disguises or documents might allow travel without being stopped by patrols. She taught them about the legal structures of slavery, which states had which laws, how slave catchers operated, what rights free black people possessed in different jurisdictions. But more importantly, she taught the same analytical method she taught in Virginia, how to observe overseer patrol patterns and identify predictable gaps, how to recognize when plantation owners were financially stressed and likely to sell people, giving advanced warning to prepare escapes, how to share information across work crews without being detected, how to read documents like travel passes well enough to forge convincing copies. She was creating a network of informed resistance, right under Clayton Marsh's observation. And Marsh was beginning to notice something wrong, though he couldn't identify what exactly. On February 27th, Samuel Grantham summoned Danina to the main house. He'd heard reports from Marsh that Danina had been talking extensively with other workers, though Marsh couldn't identify anything specifically objectionable in what she was saying. Grantham had also noticed something subtle but alarming since Danina's arrival. There had been a change in how people responded to orders, not open defiance, but a quality of deliberation. A brief pause before compliance, as if people were thinking about orders rather than just following them reflexively. In his office, Grantham questioned Danina directly about what she'd been telling people. Danina's response, recorded in Grantham's correspondence to Edward Whitmore, written 2 days later, was remarkable for its directness. "I've been answering questions people ask me," Danina said, "about how things work, about what I learned working in an office for 11 years, about geography and laws and documents. People want to understand their circumstances. I help them understand." "You're teaching resistance," Grantham said flatly. "I'm teaching understanding," Danina corrected. "Whether understanding leads to resistance is each person's choice, but ignorance doesn't prevent resistance. It just makes resistance desperate and poorly planned and likely to fail. I teach people to think before they act, to understand what they're actually facing before they decide whether to challenge it." Grantham was furious, but also strangely fascinated. He'd purchased this woman expecting to break her through fieldwork and brutality. Instead, she'd adapted to fieldwork and turned it into a teaching platform. He'd isolated her from the kind of information access she'd had in Virginia. But she was teaching from memory, from understanding, from analytical frameworks that didn't require ongoing access to documents. "You understand," Grantham said. that what you're doing is illegal. Teaching slaves is illegal. Teaching them to read is illegal. Teaching them to forge documents is illegal. Teaching them escape routes is illegal. You violated Virginia law. You're violating Georgia law. And you're doing it openly because you believe I can't stop you without proving you've been effective. And proving you've been effective would require admitting my own slaves are learning from you, which would damage my reputation. Wes, Danina said simply, I understand exactly what I'm doing and why you're constrained in how you respond. That's what 11 years of studying plantation operations teaches you. How power actually works, where its limitations are, what spaces exist within it, where different things become possible. Grantham made a decision that would ultimately cost him far more than the $600 he'd paid for Danina. He ordered her placed in solitary confinement in the plantation jail, a small brick building where resistant slaves were held for punishment or control. She would remain there, isolated from all other enslaved people, until he decided what to do with her. He couldn't sell her again. Her reputation now made her unsellable at any price. He couldn't kill her. That would be destroying his own property and would draw unwanted attention. He couldn't let her continue working alongside others because she was clearly teaching systematic resistance. So he locked her away, hoping that isolation would eventually break what brutality hadn't. Danina spent 4 days in the plantation jail. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Minimal food, no light, stone floor, temperatures that dropped near freezing at night. It was designed to be unendurable, to crush resistance through sheer physical and psychological pressure. But Danina had spent 14 years preparing her mind for exactly this kind of challenge. She'd studied how systems worked. She'd analyzed how power functioned. She'd taught herself to think strategically rather than emotionally. And she'd learned one fundamental truth about her own capabilities: that her mind was the one thing they could never actually control, no matter how completely they controlled her body. On the evening of March 3rd, 1857, Danina Lewis escaped from Grantham Plantation. The escape was accomplished with remarkable simplicity. The jail's door lock was old and poorly maintained. Danina had noticed during her confinement that the locking mechanism was visible through a gap in the door frame. Using a thin piece of metal salvaged from her dress hem, she manipulated the lock over several hours until it opened. She walked out of the jail around 10:00 p.m., moved quietly to the plantation's edge, and disappeared into the Georgia woods. The simplicity of the escape enraged Grantham more than if it had been elaborate. She hadn't needed accomplices or outside help or complex planning. She'd just observed, analyzed, and exploited a weakness in the jail's construction. She'd done to his security exactly what she'd been teaching others to do to the system itself: study it, understand it, find where it was vulnerable. Grantham immediately organized a search party: tracking dogs, armed overseers, professional slave catchers. He was determined to recapture Danina, not for her labor value, but because letting her escape after she taught his enslaved people systematic resistance would completely undermine his authority. But Danina had a significant advantage. She'd spent the previous 4 weeks studying Grantham Plantation's geography, questioning people about the surrounding area, and memorizing information about roads, rivers, towns, and potential hiding places. She'd prepared for escape, not knowing when opportunity would come, but knowing it would come eventually. And when it did, she was ready. The tracking dogs picked up her scent easily and followed it southeast for about 3 miles. Then the trail disappeared at a creek. This was standard escape technique. Water disrupts scent trails. What wasn't standard was that the dogs couldn't pick up the trail on either bank. Danina hadn't crossed the creek and continued fleeing. She'd walked in the creek itself for over 2 miles, moving with the current, leaving no scent on land for the dogs to follow. By the time the searchers realized what she'd done, Denina had a 12-hour head start, and she'd planned her route with the same analytical precision she applied to everything else. She wasn't running in panic. She was traveling strategically, using information she'd gathered, moving towards specific destinations she'd identified as offering potential refuge. Samuel Grantham's frustration reached catastrophic levels. He'd paid 600s for this woman specifically to break her and prove that intelligence couldn't protect enslaved people from the system's power. Instead, she'd taught his people systematic resistance for 4 weeks, then escaped from his jail. Using the same analytical methods she'd been teaching, he'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone he believed he could control through brutality. On March 8, 1857, 5 days after Denina's escape, Grantham did something unprecedented. He wrote to multiple plantation owners across Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, explaining what had happened and warning them about Denina Lewis. He described her intelligence, her teaching methods, her influence, and her escape. He urged them to share information about any sightings or captures, and he contributed 300 toward a reward fund for her capture. Other plantation owners, many of whom had been dealing with the discipline problems that traced back to Denina's teaching, added their own contributions. Edward Whitmore, desperate to distance himself from responsibility for creating this problem, added 200. Harrison Dobbs from Virginia added 150. Marcus Talmadge added 100. A plantation owner from North Carolina who'd never met Denina, but whose enslaved people had been influenced by her teaching methods, added 50. By March 15th, the reward for Denina Lewis's capture had reached 800, and the wanted notice circulated across multiple states described her not as a typical runaway slave, but as something far more dangerous. An educator of resistance, a teacher of systematic analysis, a woman who could make enslaved people understand their circumstances clearly enough to resist intelligently rather than desperately. The notice's language revealed the planters' fear. They weren't afraid of Denina's physical strength or capacity for violence. They were afraid of her mind, her ability to teach others to think analytically, her capacity to spread understanding that undermined the psychological foundations of slavery itself. But Denina Lewis had disappeared more completely than anyone expected. The professional slave catchers who'd successfully tracked and captured hundreds of escaped slaves over the years couldn't find any trace of her. She hadn't taken any obvious escape routes toward free states, hadn't been spotted at any of the known underground railroad stations, hadn't appeared in any of the places where fugitive slaves typically tried to obtain help. She'd simply vanished, and her vanishing was more terrifying to Southern plantation owners than her presence had been. Because no one knew where she was, what she was doing, who she was talking to, what she was teaching. The woman who'd spent years spreading systematic resistance across Virginia plantations was now free, mobile, and completely unaccounted for. The possibilities were nightmare fuel for every planter who'd built his wealth on enslaved labor. Reports began circulating in April and May 1857 about unusual incidents at plantations across Georgia and the Carolinas. A group of enslaved people at a rice plantation in South Carolina demonstrated sophisticated understanding of escape routes and legal jurisdictions that they couldn't have acquired without outside education. A cotton plantation in Georgia experienced a coordinated work slowdown where 50 people simultaneously reduced their production in ways that didn't technically violate any rules, but devastated efficiency. A tobacco farm in North Carolina discovered that several enslaved people had learned to read and were secretly teaching others using methods that suggested professional educational background. None of these incidents could be definitively linked to Denina Lewis, but plantation owners noticed that the incidents clustered geographically, creating a rough trail through northern Georgia, western South Carolina, and into North Carolina, as if someone was moving through the region, stopping at plantations long enough to teach, then moving on before being detected. The 800 reward notice was updated in June 1857 with new language. Subject may be traveling under assumed free status. May be posing as educator or domestic servant, known to spend brief periods at multiple locations before moving on. Extremely intelligent and capable of sophisticated deception. Do not approach directly. Contact local authorities immediately if spotted. The notice's tone had shifted from hunting a fugitive slave to tracking a covered operative. Denina Lewis had become something unprecedented in Southern experience, a mobile educator of resistance, someone using freedom of movement to spread the same analytical understanding she'd taught in Virginia and Georgia, but now across a much wider geography. Sarah Grimke, a prominent abolitionist from South Carolina who'd moved north, but maintained contacts in the South, wrote in her diary in August 1857 about rumors she'd heard. The entry was discovered by historians in 1901. Word has reached me of a remarkable woman, formerly enslaved, who is said to be traveling through the South, teaching others about the system's workings. The reports describe her as highly educated, analytical, and strategic in avoiding capture. Some planters believe she's a myth, an excuse slaves use to explain their own growing awareness. Others are convinced she's real and represents a threat greater than any abolitionist society. If even half of what I hear is true, this woman is accomplishing more through education than we've accomplished through propaganda. She's teaching enslaved people to understand their oppression systematically, which makes them capable of resisting intelligently. Whether Denina Lewis was actually traveling through the South teaching resistance, or whether she'd simply inspired others to continue the work she'd started, the effect was the same. Plantation discipline continued, deteriorating across multiple states. Enslaved people demonstrated increasing sophistication in their resistance, and the psychological control that slavery depended on was eroding faster than brutality could restore it. By the fall of 1857, some Southern intellectuals were beginning to articulate what Denina Lewis's existence revealed. A professor at the College of William and Mary named Edmund Ruffin wrote an essay later, published in a Richmond journal, that acknowledged the threat. We have built our society on the premise that the enslaved population lacks the intellectual capacity for systematic resistance. That education is dangerous to them, but unnecessary to us, because we already possess the understanding needed to maintain control. A single individual has proven this premise catastrophically wrong by acquiring education through observation and access to information, by developing analytical thinking despite systematic efforts to prevent it, and by teaching these capabilities to others. This one woman has demonstrated that intelligence is not a racial characteristic, but a human capacity that our system has been desperately trying to suppress. And once that suppression fails, once enslaved people begin thinking analytically about their circumstances, the entire structure becomes vulnerable to resistance we cannot adequately combat with force alone. Ruffin's essay was controversial, condemned by some as defeatist and praised by others as honest analysis, but it reflected a growing recognition among thoughtful Southerners that something fundamental had shifted, that the old assumptions about controlling enslaved people through ignorance and brutality were no longer reliable, that someone had demonstrated the power of education as resistance, and that demonstration couldn't be undone. throughout late 1857 and into 1858. Reported sightings of Denina Lewis came from increasingly distant locations: Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama. Each report followed a similar pattern: enslaved people at a plantation demonstrating unusual knowledge. Brief mentions of a woman who'd visited and taught them things. Descriptions matching Denina's appearance and known capabilities. But the reports were impossible to verify. By the time authorities investigated, the woman was always gone. The people who'd supposedly met her claimed ignorance or provided descriptions that didn't quite match. It was as if Denina Lewis had learned to move through the South like smoke, visible enough to know she was there, but impossible to grasp. That 800 reward remained active through 1858, 1859, and into 1860. It was never claimed. Denina Lewis was never captured, never confirmed dead, never located despite extensive searches and substantial financial incentive for her discovery. She'd accomplished what seemed impossible: complete disappearance while remaining actively present through her influence. And that influence continued spreading. The analytical methods she'd taught, the systematic understanding she'd shared, the frameworks for thinking about resistance strategically rather than reactively. These tools didn't require Denina's continued presence. They reproduced themselves through the people she'd educated, who educated others, who educated still others, creating cascading networks of informed resistance that Southern plantation owners couldn't contain. By 1860, with the nation moving towards civil war, multiple factors were destabilizing slavery: economic pressures, political conflicts, abolitionist activism, the growing free black population, and something else that historians would later struggle to quantify, but that enslaved people understood clearly: a shift in consciousness, a change in how people thought about their circumstances, a spreading understanding that compliance was a choice that could be withdrawn, that the system's power was more fragile than it appeared, that intelligent resistance was possible if you understood what you were resisting. Denina Lewis hadn't caused this shift alone, but she'd been a catalyst. She demonstrated that education was the most powerful form of resistance, that understanding systems was the first step toward changing them, that one person with knowledge and the courage to share it could influence hundreds of others across vast distances and extended time. The 800 reward hunting Denina Lewis had been about capturing a single woman. But what plantation owners were really trying to capture was an idea. The idea that enslaved people could think analytically about slavery, that they could understand it, analyze it, identify its vulnerabilities, and resist it strategically. That idea, once released, couldn't be recaptured. It could only spread. The historical record of Denina Lewis goes silent after the fall of 1857. The 800 reward notice continued circulating through 1858, 1859, and into 1860. But no verified sightings, no captures, no confirmed deaths. For a woman whose intelligence and teaching had made her the most wanted fugitive slave in Virginia, and one of the most sought across the South, this complete disappearance is extraordinary. It suggests either remarkable skill at concealment or successful integration into communities where her past could remain hidden. But there are fragments, hints in letters and diaries that suggest possible trajectories for what became of Denina Lewis after she vanished from Grantham Plantation that March night in 1857. A Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia named Rachel Morris wrote in her personal correspondence in October 1858 about a remarkable woman of African descent who'd spent several weeks in their community. The letter, discovered in Morris family papers in 1947, describes this woman as possessing extraordinary intellectual gifts and an unusual depth of understanding about the mechanics of Southern slavery. She spoke with precision about plantation economics, legal structures, and the psychological methods used to maintain control. Her analysis was more sophisticated than anything I'd heard from escaped slaves previously, suggesting extensive first-hand observation of slavery's operations from positions normally denied to enslaved people. She wished to continue northward, but required assistance with documentation. We provided what help we could, though she was reluctant to share details about her background that might identify her. Was this woman Denina Lewis? The description matches. Philadelphia was a logical destination for someone fleeing Georgia through the Carolinas and Virginia. The Quaker community there was known for assisting fugitive slaves, and the timeline, October 1858, is plausible for someone who'd been moving carefully through the South for 18 months, teaching and evading capture. But the letter doesn't provide a name. And Rachel Morris, protecting her community from legal exposure, deliberately avoided recording identifying details. Another fragment appears in the records of Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions accepting black students in the 1850s. A woman identified only as DL enrolled in classes in the spring semester of 1859, paying tuition through domestic service work. The college's admission records, sparse for this period, note that DL demonstrated exceptional literacy and analytical capacity uncommon even among educated whites, suggesting previous access to substantial learning opportunities. The records also note that DL left Oberlin in December 1859 to pursue teaching opportunities in Canada, a common destination for fugitive slaves seeking permanent safety from the Fugitive Slave Act. Again, no definitive proof this was Denina Lewis, but the initials match, the timeline is consistent, and the description of exceptional analytical capacity acquired through previous learning opportunities fits perfectly with someone who'd spent 11 years in a plantation office studying systematic documentation of slavery's operations. A third fragment comes from Canada itself. A black settlement near Chatham, Ontario, established by escaped slaves in the 1850s, maintained a small school for children and adults. The settlement's records preserved by the Ontario Historical Society mention a teacher who worked there from 1860 to 1863 identified as Diana Lewis, a name close enough to Denina Lewis to potentially be an assumed identity. The records describe Diana Lewis as an educator of exceptional skill who taught not merely literacy, but analytical thinking. Her methods emphasized understanding systems and structures, rather than rote learning. Students reported that Miss Lewis taught them to question how things worked rather than simply accepting them. The description of teaching methodology is strikingly similar to Denina's documented approach. Teaching people to understand systems, emphasizing analysis over memorization, focusing on frameworks for thinking rather than just facts. If this Diana Lewis was Denina, then she'd successfully escaped to Canada, established a new identity, and continued the teaching work that had made her dangerous in the South, just in a context where education was legal rather than subversive. But we cannot prove definitively that any of these fragments describe Denina Lewis. The woman in Philadelphia, the student at Oberlin, the teacher in Canada, they might all be Denina under different names and circumstances, or they might be different people whose stories happen to echo hers. The historical record is too incomplete, deliberately obscured by people protecting fugitive slaves from legal consequences to provide certainty. What we can say with certainty is this: Denina Lewis was never captured. The $800 reward was never claimed. No documented evidence exists of her death or recapture. For someone whom Southern plantation owners considered an existential threat, someone they hunted with unprecedented resources and determination, this absence of conclusive fate is itself remarkable. It suggests success either in escaping completely or in dying free rather than being returned to slavery. But while Denina Lewis's personal fate remains uncertain, the impact of what she created is absolutely clear. The methods she developed for teaching systematic resistance, the analytical framework she shared, the understanding she spread about how slavery actually functioned. These tools outlasted her direct involvement and continued reshaping how enslaved people thought about their circumstances. Multiple historians studying the period immediately before the Civil War have noted something they struggle to fully explain: a measurable increase in sophisticated resistance strategies among enslaved people in the late 1850s. Not just more escapes, but better planned escapes with higher success rates. Not just work slowdowns, but coordinated collective actions that were difficult to punish without disrupting entire operations. Not just individual acts of defiance, but systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities in plantation management. This change in resistance patterns appears most pronounced in Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, the exact regions where Denina Lewis taught before and after her escape. But the patterns spread beyond those areas, suggesting that the people she taught directly were teaching others, creating cascading networks of informed resistance. A plantation owner in Mississippi named Charles Davenport wrote in his diary in April 1860, an entry later published by historians about the changing nature of the challenge he faced. "It's not that my people are more rebellious than they were 5 years ago. It's that they're more intelligent about their rebellion. They've learned to coordinate without being caught coordinating. They've learned to disrupt operations in ways that appear accidental rather than deliberate. They've learned to share information through channels I can't identify or control. It's as if someone taught them to think strategically about resistance rather than just reacting emotionally to oppression. And I don't know how to combat that, because I can't punish people for thinking differently. Even if that thinking leads to actions I can't tolerate." Davenport had identified exactly what Denina Lewis had created: a change in how people thought, a shift from reactive resistance to strategic resistance, an understanding that thinking was itself a form of power that couldn't be stripped away through brutality. The Civil War, when it came in 1861, was fought over many issues, but enslaved people's role in that war reflected exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Denina's teaching had cultivated. They didn't wait passively for liberation. They actively contributed to Union victory through carefully calculated actions, escaping to Union lines at moments that would most disrupt Confederate operations, sharing intelligence about Confederate movements and supply lines, coordinating work slowdowns on plantations that produced war materials, sabotaging infrastructure in ways that appeared accidental but were actually deliberate. These actions required exactly what Denina had taught: understanding of how systems worked, analysis of where they were vulnerable, strategic timing of resistance to maximize impact while minimizing personal risk, the capacity to think several steps ahead rather than just reacting to immediate circumstances. Frederick Douglass, speaking in 1863 about Black contributions to the Union war effort, said something that perfectly captured what Denina Lewis had been teaching 2 decades before the war began. "The enslaved people of the South are not merely victims awaiting rescue. They are strategic actors who understand their circumstances with remarkable clarity and who choose their actions based on careful calculation of consequences and opportunities. They have learned through means we often don't fully understand to think analytically about their oppression, and that analytical thinking is as powerful a weapon as any rifle in bringing about slavery's destruction." After the war, during Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved people began documenting their experiences, multiple accounts reference the importance of education and understanding in enabling resistance. a woman named Martha Jenkins, interviewed in 1882 about her experience escaping from a Virginia plantation in 1859, said something that suggests direct or indirect influence from Denina's teaching. "I didn't just run. I planned. I studied the patrol routes. I figured out which documents I'd need and how to get them. I calculated the best time of year, based on when the overseers were most distracted. I learned all this from other people who'd learned it, from someone who understood how the whole system worked. By the time I ran, I knew exactly what I was doing and why it would work. That knowledge made all the difference between escaping successfully and just getting caught and punished." The question of whether Martha Jenkins's knowledge ultimately traced back to Denina Lewis specifically, or to the broader spread of analytical thinking that Denina had helped catalyze, is impossible to answer. But the methodology she described, systematic study, strategic planning, understanding the system before attempting to challenge it, was exactly what Denina had taught. In the decades after emancipation, as Black communities built schools and institutions throughout the South, the emphasis on education took on almost religious significance. Former slaves understood with visceral clarity what Denina Lewis had demonstrated intellectually: that education was power. That understanding systems was the first step toward changing them. That ignorance was a tool of oppression, and knowledge was a weapon of liberation. Booker T. Washington, speaking at Tuskegee Institute in 1895, articulated this connection explicitly. "Our people understand, perhaps better than any other group in human history, the transformative power of education, because we experience directly what it means to be denied education, to have knowledge criminalized, to have understanding treated as a threat to social order. And we experienced the opposite as well. How even basic literacy, even elementary understanding of how the world works, creates possibilities that ignorance can never access. Every school we build, every child we teach to read, every person we help to understand the systems that constrain them. These are acts of resistance against the legacy of a system that required our ignorance to function." Washington's emphasis on education as resistance echoed what Denina Lewis had demonstrated half a century earlier. That teaching was the most powerful form of rebellion, that spreading understanding was more dangerous to oppressive systems than any physical violence, that one person with knowledge and the courage to share it could influence countless others across vast distances and extended time. The story of Denina Lewis reminds us that resistance takes forms we often don't recognize as resistance. Not dramatic confrontations or violent rebellions, but quiet teaching in stolen moments, information shared in whispered conversations, understanding spread through networks that leave no documentary trail. These acts might seem small compared to famous slave revolts or daring escapes, but they accumulate. They compound. They plant seeds that grow in directions no one can predict or control. What Denina Lewis did between 1847 and 1857 didn't end slavery, didn't spark the Civil War, didn't directly liberate anyone. She just taught people to think differently about their circumstances, to understand rather than just endure, to analyze rather than just react, to recognize that the system's power was more fragile than it appeared, and that knowledge of that fragility was itself a form of power. But those small acts of teaching created ripples that spread farther than anyone could measure. Every person she taught directly taught others. Every analytical framework she shared was refined and extended by people who used it to make sense of their own circumstances. Every moment of understanding she created generated possibilities for strategic action that wouldn't have existed in ignorance. The plantation owners who contributed to that 800 reward understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it clearly. They weren't really hunting one woman. They were trying to contain an idea. The idea that enslaved people could think analytically about slavery, that they could understand its mechanics, identify its vulnerabilities, and resist it intelligently rather than desperately. But ideas once released can't be captured. They can only spread. And the idea that Denina Lewis embodied and taught spread far beyond anything she could have accomplished alone. It spread through the networks she'd helped create, through the people she'd educated who educated others, through the examples of successful strategic resistance that demonstrated what informed action could accomplish. Through the growing recognition among enslaved people that thinking clearly about oppression was the first step toward ending it. Here at True Slavery Stories, we uncover these narratives of intellectual resistance not because they're comfortable, but because they're essential. They show us that power structures depend on ignorance as much as force. That education is always revolutionary in contexts where the powerful require the powerless to remain uninformed. That one person teaching others to think can be more dangerous to oppression than 100 people fighting with weapons. What happened to Denina Lewis after 1857? We'll likely never know for certain. The fragments suggest she survived, escaped, possibly lived free in Canada or the northern United States. But even if she died in those Georgia woods, even if she was captured and never recorded, even if her fate was worse than the uncertainty that remains, what she created survived her. The method she taught, the understanding she spread, the proof she provided that education was power, and that power could never be completely controlled by those who claimed to own everything. By 1860, with war approaching, Southern intellectuals were beginning to recognize what they'd lost. Not just control over individual enslaved people, but something more fundamental. The assumption that enslaved people would remain ignorant enough to accept their circumstances as natural and inevitable. That assumption, once abandoned, couldn't be restored, and without it, the entire system was vulnerable in ways that no amount of violence could defend against. Denina Lewis was sold at 16 because someone saw value in her potential, hunted at 30 because she'd realized that potential in ways that terrified everyone who'd built their lives on denying such potential could exist. In between, she transformed from property into teacher, from victim into strategist, from someone acted upon into someone who acted deliberately and effectively to change how hundreds of others understood their world. Her story is a reminder that the most powerful resistance doesn't always look powerful at the time. That teaching one person who teaches two people, who each teach two more, creates exponential change that no authority can fully suppress. That understanding is always dangerous to systems built on ignorance, regardless of how much force those systems command. We tell this story not to romanticize slavery or resistance, or to suggest that intellectual work is equivalent to the physical suffering enslaved people endured. We tell it because it reveals something true about power and knowledge and human capability. That thinking clearly is always revolutionary in contexts where the powerful require the powerless to remain confused. That education is always subversive when systems depend on ignorance. That one person with knowledge and the determination to share it can change hundreds of minds. And changed minds eventually change the world. What do you think about Denina Lewis's choice to resist through teaching rather than violence? Was her intellectual resistance more or less powerful than physical rebellion? How do we measure the impact of someone who changed how people think versus someone who changed immediate circumstances through dramatic action? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strategic intellectual resistance moved you, if it revealed something about power and education that you hadn't considered before. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that thinking clearly about oppression is itself an act of resistance. These buried stories of intellectual courage don't tell themselves, and the lessons they contain about knowledge's power remain as relevant now as they were in 1857. See you in the next.